Happy Friday, everyone. Hey, it's me again. I wanted to circle back to talk about Ukraine and Russia. It's a very important subject that's about to come to a head. I won't say very quickly because we don't know how long it's going to last, but it's over. It's over. A few months ago, I posted a video talking about what I thought would happen. The idea was that Russia would continue to capture along the Black Sea, and there's a reason for that, and there's a good video of why they want the Black Sea, and they would leave most of Western Ukraine untouched because they really didn't want to deal with a bunch of ethnic Ukrainians who wanted to fight, and you don't want to be bogged down in an insurgency. Hmm? Uh, and so the Russians, they took the east. They have the Donbass, which is the Luhansk and Donetsk region. If you're Nikki Haley, you may want to learn those terms before you actually step on stage with Vivek. Yeah, that happened. Greatness. However, my original idea was Russia does not want to go too far west. They don't even really want to capture Kiev. It's too much of a headache. And the way things have shaped and panned out, I don't know if that is a forever belief. So one of my arguments, and you'll hear this from a lot of my content, is that the Eastern way of thinking, and yes, Russia is an Eastern thinker. They're not Western, even though they're part of Europe. They straddle both sides, and in most chances, they do think like Eastern folk. Now, Eastern folk, they think long time horizons, yes? And so my question was, can Ukraine fight and sustain this fight for another 2 years? Probably not. Could they sustain it for another 10 years? What would that look like for them? Can they sustain it for 20 years? Probably not. Longer time horizons than what we're expecting out of CNN and everything else. That's that's the Western way of thinking. Short, decisive victories. But they have to think about long term. You're having a demographic collapse in Ukraine, which brings me to my revision of my idea of a rump Ukraine that doesn't have water access, that is completely landlocked, with a new Russian Federation taking the water. Anyway, here's the prediction. So back in the day, I worked for a gentleman named Dr. Colonel Dave McIntyre. He was the dean of faculty at the U.S. War College, which is where they teach not tactical understanding of military, but a level above that, nation building, nation destroying. Basically, this type of stuff they write out, and they game plan it, they war game it, they do all contingencies. What happens if Russia and Uganda are allied together in a battle against Finland? You know, they think of all this stupid crap, and they kind of play it out. How does it work? How do you win this conflict? They think of everything from finances to religion to economics. It's all encompassing. So this guy was kind of a big deal. He was the faculty there. Then he ended up being the dean of the Bush School in Texas A&M, which is where I met him. And he ended up running for Congress, which is when I got to work with him. But he tells this story prior to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And it's very important to this right here, and I'll get to it why. So he tells a story where he's in the White House. He's got the Joint Chiefs sitting in a debriefing with him, and he's got George W. Bush in the meeting with him. And he basically says, look, guys, I've read your shock and awe. It's great. It's going to work. You're going to beat everything. But it's not going to work because you're going to be tied down into a decades-long insurgency, because you're going to overwhelm them with so much technology that they're going to flee. They're going to drop their AKs, and they're going to go underground. They may not drop them, but figuratively speaking, you won't see them. They won't be in uniform anymore. They're going to be in street clothes. And you don't want to do that. You want to have a slow, methodical fight. And you want to be able to kill all those people that are Al-Takriti, which is Saddam's tribal name. if you ever heard the word Tikrit, or the township, that's where Saddam's from. His tribe is the Al-Tikriti tribe. Anyway, you want to fight them methodically, and it's slow. You're going to have to deal with all their tanks. You might take some casualties up front, but it's better than dealing with a long, drawn-out fight. Now, the Joint Chiefs hated this, and they said, no, 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 we need to show that we're America. Yeah. And we're overwhelming them, and we had air supremacy over Iraq in 13 minutes, the time it takes for our planes to go from one side to the other. We owned the skies immediately. We bombed the crap out of them, shock and awe. They had no chance. But when we did that, just as Colonel McIntyre analyzed, all the military-aged men would go underground, and we'd be fighting them for the next decade, which is what happened. But the calculus there was, hey, we don't want to lose American soldiers in a long, drawn-out fight. We don't want to do this at the beginning, because then we might get bogged down in perhaps a proxy war. Sound familiar? We don't need another Vietnam. We don't need another Afghanistan for the Soviets. We want to overwhelm them, and then we'll pick up the pieces later. Okay, so to tell the story as Dave did, he kept saying, no shock and awe. Don't do it. Don't do it. Have a slow fight that will win it conventionally and convincingly. You'll have more U.S. casualties up front, but it'll be over with, and you'll have a stable Iraq afterwards, instead of an unstable Iraq with however many factions fighting it out even today. And so he tells the story that this was the only time in history, supposedly, that the Joint Chiefs have walked out on a sitting president. And it was just him and George Bush in the room together, and George is like, well, I hope you're wrong. And Dr. Colonel McIntyre says, well, I hope I'm wrong too. Because what we ended up doing in Iraq, following the Joint Chiefs, ended up being terrible, and now we're seeing the fruits of that policy. So anyway, why this is important to Russia and Ukraine. So a lot of people have this myth that Russia went all in March and February of 2022. It was the Russian regulars, and this was really just a myth. So and I'll explain why. Initially, Russia didn't send in their military. What they were doing was, there was a lot of expatriates in the middle of this civil war. So this area over here is ethnically Russian. This area is ethnically Ukrainian. They're all Ukrainian citizens. So what do we call that? We call that a civil war. This civil war has been raging since 2008. You've had a lot of people leave the Donbass area and go to Russia, to their ethnic cousins, and end up getting trained, seeking refuge, whatever. So when the conflict of Russia invading Ukraine, it was really mostly rearming these Ukrainian civilians, who are citizens, sorry, I'll say it that way. They're Ukrainian citizens who fled to Russia, got trained, got equipped, then came back en masse. I remember when it first happened, you'd see silly like ice cream trucks, and they're like, ha ha ha, the Russian military is using ice cream trucks. It's like, they're not Russian military. They're Donbass militia who were in Russia. They got supplies and they got other stuff. It wasn't Russian military ice cream trucks. That's the problem. So the fighting goes on. The militia doesn't actually win the war, and it became, and I can prove to you that it wasn't the Russian military per se, because the whole point of adopting these provinces into the Russian Federation was Putin's way of activating them legally, activating the Russian military legally to join the fight. They had to move from a special operation, a proxy war with Ukraine, to an actual war where Russian military would be legit part of the fight, not just, maybe sprinkled in, maybe, giving intelligence and all that. Most of the fighters in that initial phase were Ukrainian citizens who were ethnically Russian. So, where are we today? Why did I tell you about Iraq and shock and awe? Well, here we are. I've already talked about the demographic collapse. You've had a lot of Ukrainians who didn't support Zelensky and didn't support the war, or maybe they just didn't want to be part of a war. They fled to Europe, They left, and then you have all these guys here, and they've been fighting, and they've been drafted. There's numerous reports of how many actual able-bodied men are left, how many Ukrainian able-bodied men are left. Kiev has been contacting Western leaders saying, hey, send back all those guys that fled. Don't allow them to have amnesty anymore because they're running out of guys here. So what does that mean? What does that mean? I think Russia, knowing that they didn't get the win that they wanted immediately, they're sitting back behind the Surovikin line, which is an important thing. It's a defensive line, and they've been collecting casualties on Ukraine. They've been XP farming pretty much a lot of Ukrainian bodies. I don't mean to be flippant about it, but that's basically what it's been. Ukraine has been throwing everything, including the kitchen sink, to recapture the Azov Sea, and they've been failing. And they keep throwing everything they can at this. So what does this mean for Russia? Well, just like Dave McIntyre said, you want to have a decisive, long, drawn-out victory over time where you eat up all of the military-aged men in Iraq, in Ukraine, so that you'll have an easy victory later. And that's what's going to happen. Because the demographic collapse is here, Poland is not going to come into Ukraine and fill them up. Russia will. When Russia starts making their move, it's going to be very, very easy. There might be pockets of resistance in big cities, but they'll get encircled and just held out for a while until you have these magistrates of these cities just throw up their hands. And you know, to be honest, with the reports coming out of Ukraine right now, the local magistrates who kept everything going during the initial phase, they've been getting iced out from all the decision making that's been happening in Kiev. Even the mayor of Kiev is going against Zelensky at this because he's not being given the resources or the intel to effectively do his job anymore. And so you're starting to see these breakdowns going on in the Ukrainian side. And so my point is that instead of having that big awesome victory where Russia was going to take over all this, like all the doomers said, instead they perpetuated a long drawn out war that Ukraine couldn't win, that's actually going to give them more land, going to result in Russia winning more land than they initially intended to get. Remember, they only wanted the Russian majority provinces. That's who they were fighting for. That and Crimea getting the water supply, which is also Russian majority. Let's be clear. And if you need more information on that, back when the Civil War started, the Ukrainians committed a war crime against humanity where they dammed up the Dnieper River so that no water could flow to Crimea. It was internationally condemned, blah, blah, blah. Russia was having to, they're having to boat in potable water so that, 3 million people could actually drink water on a daily basis. It's a humanitarian crisis. The first 6 hours of the Russian invasion, they blew up those dams, those concrete dams that were holding back the water to civilian population. So, anyways, it's a very complicated situation, and I think because we have reacted this way in the West, we're going to actually see Ukraine fall in the worst fears that we had at the beginning. And that's where we are today. All right, guys, have a good weekend.